Hi, I'm Jeremy, or Dr. J,
And I'm Ronnie West.
and this is Good Parents, Good Children.
Parenting, feeling morally virtuous whilst picking on someone not your own size.
So, Ronnie, there's a picture of grandparents that the main thing they're supposed to do is give kids a bunch of candy and treats and take them out to do fun things. And I remember my parents had taken our kids one time, and my parents, who are great with the children and are awesome grandparents, and they were bringing them back to us. Well, yeah, we went and told them two stories, and they kept getting out of bed, and so we gave them some cheese and a snack. Like, wait a minute, you broke my children? And we have a little bit of a different picture for who grandparents are supposed to be. So why don't you tell us, what's the goal of grandparenting?
So I think that there's several things, but I think one of the first concepts I think we should look at is what I would refer to as bounded support, right?
Okay.
So there's two really important pieces of that. You're a support for the parents and for the grandkids, for your, for your children and their children, right? You're supporting both of them, but it's bounded. Mm-hmm. So there's boundaries in both directions. So as a grandparent, and I've seen this work in a negative way in both directions, where there are grandparents that they get used for their finances, they get used for their time, they enable bad behavior, the relationship is being abused a little bit by their children or by their children's children, right? So that's bad boundaries on the part of the grandparents, and they aren't enforcing appropriate boundaries, which is not good for anybody. Okay, when you allow someone to use you, you're using each other in a sense, because when you're letting that person do a bad thing, which makes them worse for it. So grandparents need to set boundaries as far as how much support they'll give, but then it goes the other way. Parents need to set boundaries on the grandparents, because the parents are the primary authority. They're where the buck stops at the parents. So the grandparent role is primarily a supportive role. They shouldn't force their help onto the parents. They shouldn't use coercion or manipulation to press on the parents things. It should be something that's voluntary. So it's sort of a mutual respect. The hope will be that the grandparents have a great relationship with their kids, a great relationship with their grandkids, and that their children will want them involved in the lives of their children's children, and that they will respect their children as parents. That's the dream scenario. So there's this mutual respect. That's a good place to be, to have solid boundaries in both directions. And for there to be, it's almost like you've got this mutual consent. Now, the challenge with this is the parents are the ones that get to set the pace, right? Like, they're the ones that are primarily responsible for the grandkids. They control access to the grandkids. They have the primary authority, but so they're the ones that are going to sort of give the okay on how the relationship is going to look. But if there's mutual respect, that lubricates the whole machine and makes everything go smoother.
Well, you said that grandparents shouldn't force themselves into or onto grandchildren. Don't grandparents have some sort of right to see their grandkids or role in this process?
See, and with that, legally, my opinion would be that there shouldn't be legal rights, although there's sticky situations where, maybe there should be or what have you. So that can be kind of tough, but I guess I don't want to get in the legal part. As far as morally speaking, I think that, okay, let's say, there's a parent, they have children, and, that person's parents are alive. So there's this grandparent situation going on. Denying access to the grandkids for no really good reason is wrong to do, I would think. I think that would be a immoral thing. The goal is to let the grandparents have lots of access to their grandkids. You're the gatekeeper, but the hope is they'll have lots of good access to their grandkids, especially if they're decent people that are pursuing virtue and competence, and they're good examples, and they're doing the kinds of things you need them to be doing, and they respect your boundaries. Then let them have a lot of access to the grandkids if you can. right? That's what you want to do. That's the goal. And if they're bad people and they're terrible examples, then they lose, they lose that privilege or right or whatever you want to call it. They're not going to get as much.
I think most of what you've been saying has to do with a natural order or a natural hierarchy of things, which is that parents bear the primary, ultimate, and in some ways sole responsibility for raising the children, and really that the role of grandparents is to support the parents' authority. You might even view them as parent extenders. And so what that means is, yes, they're offering advice and input, and parents should want to seek these things out. And they, yes, might be providing some, let's say, tangibles like babysitting or financials, but more so, they're helping to enact the parents' plan for the children.
Right.
So if the parents are developing the behavioral plans, including different reinforcement schedules, that they have different punishment styles, it's almost, you kind of have to make the negative case first. Like, grandparents ought not undermine, or, well, we don't do punishment when you're at our house, or, oh, we always eat dessert first.
Yeah, you want a situation where the grandkids are better for having been around the grandparents. Like, that has got to be a part of the goal.
Yeah, say more about that.
So, you can look at that on the macro scale. That would be grandparents should be good mentors. They should be pursuing virtue and competence in themselves. They're a good example to the grandkids. So in that way, it's going on. But also, as they have opportunity, they explicitly and directly teach virtue and morality and good advice on how to be virtuous and competent to the grandkids. So they're both an example and they're expressing what it is. And they're better off. So that's like the macro, right? Like, they're helping the parents reach those parental goals over time. They're not a boundary or a barrier to that. So that would be one. But then even on the micro, wouldn't it be nice if the grandkids are slightly more well-behaved for the next few days or week after being with the grandparents? Like there's the joke about, oh, I get to spoil them, so I'm going to fill them up with sugar and put them to bed late. Why?
Because I want them to like me.
Right. Like, bribing them to like you is not the best way to get kids to like you anyway. Like, that shouldn't be the primary strategy. And the kids are more enjoyable to be around when you're not engaging in too much of that.
All right. So I've taken the position that spoiling actually has an operational definition. Yeah. And if you think about spoiling and it's not a metaphor, then that means something that's rotten, right? So a spoiled child is like a spoiled egg or a dish. They're smelly and they're not appetizing. So
I don't want to eat them. They need a bath.
Yeah, thank you. A spoiled child, for our purposes, behaviorism no longer works on them.
Oh, right. Yeah, because you want a situation where they respond to the appropriate rewards, disciplines, punishments, and then the grandparents have actually done things which make them less responsive.
That's correct. So if you want to maintain, all right, in our home, candy and desserts are a privilege for people who have finished their chores, people who have gone above and beyond in the ways that we expect. But then you take them to the grandparents and they get as much as they want. Well, you can't use those reinforcers anymore. They're no longer effective.
They're reduced at least anyway, right?
The kid has actually been spoiled because our parental interventions don't work anymore, at least till we fix them again.
Right.
You're pulling for worse behavior.
If they have all the toys, you can't be giving toys as a reward. Okay, this is just a side note, but the things we're talking about, it really just hit me really hard. This kind of reminds me of co-parenting problems. Right. So this is off topic, but I think this is worthwhile to look at. We might have to do a video about this some other time.
Okay.
But you send the kids to the grandparents. Let's say you just do that once or twice a month. Then if they spoil them some and whatever, it may not be the end of the world. And you as parents could be training the kids to get past that. And maybe that's how much influence the grandparents can have, because the grandparents aren't setting good boundaries. They're not an extension of helping the kid become virtuous and competent, an extension of the parents' rules. So there's limited access, right? But what if you have a situation where the kids are at the grandparents' house a lot? daycare, childcare, a lot more with the dates and things. Then it becomes even more important that that the grandparents act as an extension of the rules, structures, boundaries, schedules that parents put into play. And I mean, those grandparents are more incentivized to do it anyway, because they want the kids to behave better because they're around them more. But then you think about co-parenting, you have situations where it's 50-50. If one parent is completely loose with the rules and spoiling, and then the other wants to set guidelines and have more boundaries, it's awful.
The authoritative parent in this scenario is going to get overrun.
Right. They're set up for failure.
That's right.
But the same thing can work with grandparents, especially if the kids are around the grandparents a lot. It's kind of like having an ex-husband or ex-wife, the parent, the other parent of the child, ruining things for the parent that's trying to set boundaries.
Well, so the proper order of things is that the grandparents have already been successful parents. It's been a long time and they're at a different stage in life, but they've already been successful parents. They, by definition, if they've been pursuing virtue, are wiser than you and have more parental advice to give. They've got something to give your children, our children, that we don't have. And so when that's the case, we want our children around them. We want our children around them a lot. The issue becomes if the hierarchy gets usurped. If the hierarchy becomes, I'm older, I know better than your parents, I know better what to do. Well, that throws the whole thing out of whack.
Well, and that becomes a problem because, we're saying the grandparents should be supporting the goal of helping the parents produce virtuous and virtuous and competent young adult children, right? So the grandparents need to be doing things with that 5-year-old or 10-year-old grandchild that makes it so that when they're 15 and 20, they're more virtuous and competent. They're working with the parents in that. Well, there's virtues related to respect, obedience, submission, like those are related to virtues or have virtuous components. Well, grandparents knowing things the parents don't know and maybe having wisdom the parents don't have, but still submitting to the parents' final authority is being a good example to the grandchildren. But if they rebel against the parents' authority, even though to them it may make sense because they're older and wiser, that's still breaking down the appropriate hierarchy and they're being a bad example of the grandkids. And then that's in there now. They're being a bad mentor, which you can't be a perfect mentor. You can't be a perfect grandparent. You're not going to get this relationship perfect. And it's actually, as we've been thinking about it, there is some significant complexities between how this works. The question of, do grandparents have rights? How does that work? What are your responsibilities to the grandparents? What are their responsibilities to the kids? There's kind of a lot going on.
Well, the first relationship in play here is not actually grandchild and grandparent. It's grandparent and parent because they used to be parent and child.
Yeah.
And so
it's also the most important relationship because if you get that one right, the grandparent-grandchild relationship is likely to just follow the way it needs to.
Sure. Well, there's a certain respect differential. All right. So you've got grandparent and parent. It used to be parent-child, right? Child ought to be fully submissive to the parent, ought to be highly respectful, obedient, these sorts of things, and then growing and developing, and then they're a young adult. All right. Well, the parent who's now a grandparent probably still has lots more wisdom, definitely has lots more life experience, but it's not anymore this fully hierarchical relationship. I can't go around as an adult, can't go around disrespecting my parents or failing to be humble, but they're no longer the hierarchical boss of me.
Right. You're not answering to them.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So if we've prepared that, and this is what you're saying, then we can introduce the grandparent-grandchild relationship.
Right. Now, I will say, just as a side note, I guess there are cultures where the patriarch and matriarch, who might be the grandparent, great-grandparent, may actually have in that culture's hierarchy more authority than the parent and can just tell the parent how it's going to go, and then it goes that way to the children. We're not addressing that cultural structure because I'd have to put more thought into if that's the culture, how should that work?
Sure.
Are there ways in which it's better? Are there ways in which it's worse? What are the virtuous rules to deal with in that dynamic? That's not the norm for American Western culture. So within the American Western culture, that's not the situation. And there needs to be the show of respect I think the parents need to show respect to the grandparents in showing respect to them that they do know things, they have that experience, and the grandparents show the respect to the parents that they're the final authority. And then that showing of respect is an acting out of appropriate virtues. And the kids can see it. They can see how conflict is dealt with. If the parents say, we don't want the kids to watch movies that have this much cussing or have this content in it or whatever, and the grandparents just turn around and be like, whatever, you watch what you want.
Right.
That is undermining, very, very bad. That's going against what grandparents need to be doing. But here's the other one is if the grandparents sort of complain about the parents. Oh, I don't know. I wouldn't let you do that if I were you, or if I wouldn't be so strict if I were them. That kind of like just not letting the kids break the rules, but just whining and complaining about the rules or the boundaries that the parents want to have is another way of undermining it's a problem.
Sure. And indeed, there might be some differences in these more collectivistic, more multi-generational cultures. The issue in our culture isn't really, all right, let's be more deferential to the generations that have come before.
Right, that's not the problem.
No, our problem is more along the lines of, let's be fully permissive. And also, I can't parent. I don't know how. I've been taught by science and media that I don't have authority to do that even if I try, I'm going to fail. And that's why we think it's so important to recapture the idea that as parents, we do have ability to parent and raise our children, and actually that everybody in our lives better get on board with that, or they're going to be outbounded.
Right. Our society, I think, says that the parents can't parent, and then by extension, that means the grandparents can't set boundaries on the grandkids and train them either.
That's right.
So you're right. I think that is the primary problem. Now, I've seen the problems with grandparents that are overly involved. They don't respect the boundaries of the parents. That's definitely, that's an eternal challenge for some people, and that's the thing they need to watch for. It's like, okay, you need to, as a grandparent, if that's your temptation, figure out a way to respect your kids and their style of parenting. So for example, like advice giving is a way to support. You can support financially, you can support with childcare and, physically with time and all of this. And you could also support with advice. If the parents ask the grandparents for advice, great, perfect. What if the grandparents have amazing advice, wonderful advice, but the parents haven't asked for it? Like, how does that work? Do you just go, by the way, I've got something I want to tell you, and da 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 da? Okay. No, that's actually disrespectful. What you can do is say, hey, I had a thought I want to share with you. There's some advice I was thinking I might be interested in giving to you. May I tell you more about it? Is that okay? If you ask, and this is actually good in like all relationships, basically. If you want to give some advice, ask, may I give you advice before giving it? But certainly in this situation, it's a way to show mutual respect. You ask, may I give you this advice? Or may I tell you more about the topic? Or you could say, I wanted to give you advice on how to deal with this bedtime routine situation, or this behavior that, maybe is a problem. And then if they say, yeah, I'd love to hear about it, or maybe I'd like to hear about it some other time, you respect their answer. No is allowed. No, if you won't take no for an answer, then why should they listen to your advice?
Well, and this is about the virtues of humility, the value of intellectual curiosity, and even the honesty of recognizing, well, I don't know all there is to know. So that's a great way to reinforce that parent-grandparent relationship.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about what is the proper frame for a grandparent-grandchild relationship. And no doubt one of them is familial and loving. It's certainly closer, and ought to be closer than, just another older adult in your life. Right. But one frame for this is actually that mentor relationship, and especially as you're moving into the preteen and teenage years.
So there's sort of two. I can think of two things, right?
Okay.
Like assuming the grandparents are being appropriate, and they the parents are letting them have a relationship with grandkids, which is what should happen the vast majority of the time, if all possible. If that's the case, then there's two things. There's the main grandparent relationship, and I think mentoring is a huge part of that. And they're there to support the grandchild. They get to know the grandchild. They're around them. It's time. It's emotional support. It's all that, and it's mentorship where they're a good example and they're overtly teaching, and it's all those things. And then I would be remiss to not mention this. It is useful for grandparents to be prepared for tragedy. One of the things grandparents are available for is if the parents turn out to be incompetent, have trouble with the law, or they die or whatever, then it's good for grandparents to be prepared to help with the raising of the grandkids in a much more direct way. If that happens, that is a useful thing. So I think that is something worth noting. That shouldn't be the primary. If that happens, then tragedy happens. So the primary relationship is going to be this sort of familial mentorship one.
I suppose I was thinking about different fables and how they kind of relate. And so the grandparent you don't want is like the witch in the woods who waits for Hansel and Gretel and then fattens them up with sweets, right?
Well, that just makes me think so we just did the video about the wolves at the door or whatever. Part of what you're describing then is actually the degree. So with the wolves at the door, it's the idea that there are people that they want to have negative influence on your kids. We got into the reasons for that. But what you just described is a grandparent who partially is a wolf at the door.
That's right.
Right. And why? Well, in part, it's because they're treating the grandchildren not as people who deserve, a certain respect. The grandkids in that point are an item. They're a tool to be used. They're used for affection, or they're used for pride.
For self-gratification.
For self-gratification of the grandparent.
Yes.
And so that I think might be part of what happens with the spoiling or the bribing or whatever, possibly. And what should be happening is supporting the parent in what we believe to be the pinnacle parental goal of producing virtuous and competent adults. Young adults, right? The grandparents are helping with that. That's treating them the way they need to be treated. And I mean, they're also going to get a lot of those benefits of affection and family time and all that stuff, but that's not the primary purpose. You never sacrifice the goal of virtuous and competent children for the goal of personal gratification.
Well, and it's
which nobody does overtly. I don't think the grandparents are like, I'm going to use my grandchildren.
Well,
fatten them up with sweets.
Because
it could be accidental.
Because it's not necessarily a problem, really, if the grandparenting relationship is rewarding. Goodness, it ought to be.
Oh, it's wonderful. Yeah.
The trouble is if that happens to usurp the long-term goal, which, as we've said, the long-term goal of parenting has really very little to do with children and very much to do with adults.
End product.
Within product. So children, we all are, but especially children, are always in developing states. And what we want to do is keep them developing and not stunt them at, I have found the candy trigger.
It's like putting roadblocks, putting up boundaries between where they are and the goal.
That's right. And so then there's something to overcome instead of putting like springboards toward the goal that you can jump ahead.
Right. Well, and you were describing that. I mean, we're going to advocate as we have time in these videos, we're going to advocate for the use of various interventions, right? Rewards, discipline, punishments, behavioral interventions. And what you described was you were defining spoiled, which I think this was very useful. When you spoil, what you are doing is you're making the upcoming behavioral interventions less effective.
That's right.
Right. Well, that's a roadblock. Right. That's getting in the way. Now, since we're human and we make mistakes, chances are in whatever relationships we have, we're going to accidentally put up roadblocks. Can't be perfect. But in general, grandparents overall should be helping bring the child along the correct road and moving along it, and help the kids keep their eyes open to see what it ought to be. Moving towards that path of the virtue and the competence, not these roadblocks.
So hang with us. There's lots more to come. Ronnie, what else you got today?
I actually do have one more thing. I think this is sort of the last thing. A problem I've noticed, and this happens with grandparents who become the primary caretaker, or they're taking up almost half the time, and that is the naive and gullible grandparent.
Right.
Yes. So this is related to the Wolves at the Door video, which you should definitely watch. But I think that grandparents have a particular role with this. If a grandparent finds that they're taking up a significant minority of the boundary creating, the parenting role over kids, you can't afford to be naive about the struggles of that teenager. Because I've seen teenagers that I've done therapy with and other kids where when that happens, it's so easy for them to embrace promiscuity, drug use, all kinds of problem behaviors. And the grandparents are just sort of turning a blind eye to it. Maybe because they can't handle thinking about it, or they don't want to think about it. If grandparents find themselves in a position where their grandkids need protecting, you can't afford to live with your eyes closed. You've got to have your eyes open to those potential dangers. That's my last nugget.
And with that, stay good out there.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Ronnie West.
And I'm Jeremy, or Dr. J.
This is Good Parents, Good Children.
Parenting, it's like bullying for fun and profit.